over time to secretaries of state as well as ambassadors and others from the State Department is, can you name for me instances where sanctions have changed behavior for the better? And I'm not going to ask you that question now. I'm going to wait till you come back to ask you. There's a preview of what I'll ask you the next time. But the reason I bring that up is that I think hopefully people think of sanctions as a way of trying to modulate behavior. You want better behavior out of a country. A country's doing something you don't like. You'd like them to change their behavior for better through sanctions. And I think it rarely works. And I think we pile more on. Now, some would say, well, sanctions are just to punish them, and we just want to, Russia invaded Ukraine, we're just punishing them. And so as punishment, they kind of work. I don't think they're deterring Russia's behavior or changing it. But really, sanctions can have effect in a couple of ways. I think the threat of a sanction, the same way the threat of a tariff can have an effect on behavior. But once placed, I think a sanction or a tariff only has effect on someone's behavior if you remove it. Now, you mentioned earlier a little bit about discussing ways to unwind some of the sanctions ultimately on Russia. People mentioned, well, we never want to let them sell energy again. No, you have to let people enter back into the world. That's how you're going to get behavioral changes. And it really will have to be part of the peace. If there is going to be a negotiated peace, the one aspect that makes us part of that war are all the sanctions. And so it really should be offered up of removing that and going back to normalcy when we can find a resolution to the war. I'll give you an example of where I think often the State Department loses its sight of its mission. Instead of being the Department of Diplomacy, which I think it's supposed to be, it becomes just an extension of the Department of War and muscle, and we show how strong we are through the State Department. But really, when bellicose statements come from other parts of the government, I see the State Department as the one that shows up and tries to still have a conversation. In the past, I think because of remarks, you had been banned from travel to China. The ambassador that's been nominated also has had statements that make us question whether or not he'll be received in China if he becomes the ambassador to China. When Blinken and Yellen went to China recently, they decided, and I'm not arguing with the goal was to get China not to sell dual-use parts to Russia to use in the war against Ukraine. A noble goal, I share the goal. But they got to China and they shamed them in public and called them names and told them they're terrible people and they should quit doing it. I would argue that there's another way to try to get behavioral changes. I would argue that the opposite of sanctions is trade. And so we have a lot of sanctions on China. If I'd been the one going to China with a mission, I would have said to China very quietly, we may not be able to undo everything, but perhaps we could undo one bit of sanctions that will enhance your economy by X amount if you'll agree to quit selling dual-use parts to Russia. And I think that's just it's a different look on things, and I don't think we're getting it very often. I guess my hope is that you will think about a different way of doing business other than just saying, let's sanction everybody and let's call people names we don't like, because I don't think it helps. I think it actually makes the situation worse. And that doesn't mean we curl up in a ball and just say, do whatever you want, but there has to be some give and take. There has to be something we take back. And so I guess my general question to you would be, we know a lot about the stick. We know about sanctions and this and that. Do you see any possibility of any carrot with China to make relations better with China?
Well, let me first say, indeed, I've been strongly worded in my views of China. Let me just point out, they've said mean things about me, too. And I'm not sure that they're fans of mine in that regard here. My role now as the Secretary of State is to lead the diplomatic wing of the country, and that will involve engaging them. The fact of the matter is, in a mature and prudent conversation, and I would expect that they, at the end of the day, are also mature and prudent practitioners of foreign policy. They've got 1 billion people and nuclear weapons and a large economy. We have 400 million people, the largest economy in the world in nuclear weapons, and it is in their interest, our interest, and the interest of the world for two great powers to be able to communicate. In fact, despite everything I have said, I have consistently throughout my career said that it is that geopolitical balance between our countries, or imbalance, developing imbalance, that is the greatest risk to global security and prosperity, because that could quickly trigger not just a trade and economic conflict, but an armed one, which could be catastrophic. Never in the history of mankind have two powers like the United States and China ever faced off in a global conflict, and the outcome would be catastrophic, and we should want to avoid it, and so should they. So the bottom line is this: yes, we are going to have to deal with China. They're too big and too important in the world, and they're going to have to deal with us. And my goal is that it is dealt with in a way that furthers our national interest. What cannot continue to happen is that China continues to assume all of the benefits of the international system and none of its obligations, all the benefits of global trade and commerce and none of its obligations. Your point on sanctions are important. I think that one of the things that's happened over time is we have adopted this view that we're going to be involved in less armed conflicts, which I think is a positive, generally speaking, right? Most would agree. The only other alternative left in the toolbox then is economic sanctions. And while I do think that you can question whether it has an impact over the changing the behavior of a country, it can achieve two things. The first is it can deny a nation state the resources they could use to fund more of that activity. Let there be no doubt. If the Iranian regime had more money because of no sanctions, they would have spent more money on Hezbollah and Hamas and their missile program and the Houthis and others. So I do think there is value in that regard. And the second is, to be frank, leverage. When you sit down at a table, let's say we talk about Ukraine and the need to end that conflict, when you get and sit at the table, and the United States is involved in those conversations, hopefully, to reach a peaceful settlement of that conflict, you're going to have to give, not just get. And sanctions and the release of sanctions could be a part of that, assuming that the conditions are appropriate. So I do think sanctions also have a role to play in that regard. But I would not diminish the part about denying resources for governments and countries to carry out nefarious, denying them the ability to have the resources to carry out these nefarious activities.
I think you're right, and the point is probably valid with regard to Iran. Probably not so much with China. I don't think we've denied China resources, and I think their resources extend beyond what we can do. I think our sanctions are more, prodding them, but not really damaging their economic prospects. With regard to the concept of diplomacy and how we make things better, or attempt to make things better, I think if we have absolutes, we tend to not understand really the way diplomacy has to work, because it is about engagement, it's about hearing the other side. It's not about accepting their position, but it's about at least knowing what the position of the other side is. With regard to NATO and Ukraine, to a person, the State Department under the previous administration is adamant, and so are many Republicans, that there is absolutely no way we will ever say that Ukraine could be a neutral country, that absolutely they will be, and it is our absolute prerogative to invite anybody we want to into NATO. Well, we can say that, and we have the ability to do that, but there are consequences to that, and one of the consequences is that, at least from the Russian perspective, they see that as one of the reasons why the war has developed there. And so I think that if you are looking at peace, you have to look at first you have to get to a ceasefire before you even get to real discussions. But if you had a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine, I think our sanctions need to be on the table as far as negotiating the removal of them. But I think also the idea of Ukraine being a neutral country as far as a military alliance, if it's not on the table, Ukraine doesn't have that much to offer. I mean, Russia now occupies a good 15-20% of the country. It's been a big bloody war, and they've done it in a sort of World War I fashion, but I don't think they're going anywhere. It is at a stalemate. But the one thing Ukraine has to offer is they won't become part of a military alliance allied against Russia. Just not taking it off the table enhances our ability to negotiate and enhances Ukraine's ability. I think Zelensky's public words have been a little less firm than they had been in the past. But instead, I think we've done the opposite with our diplomacy. Every day, it's Blinken, beating the drums. They absolutely be in Ukraine. Do you think that the concept of a neutral Ukraine, not in NATO, can be part of the negotiations to end the war?
Well, obviously, that's something that will ultimately be part of any negotiation. I do agree with your point that if we want to be real here for a second, because I think we've lost the art of reality in some of the foreign policy. These are not outcomes that are rarely are they ideal. Sadly, in many cases, our choices in foreign policy are a choice between a bad outcome and an even worse outcome. And that's been true not in the modern era, but throughout the history of diplomacy and nation-state relations. In the case of conflicts such as these, they invariably require concessions. I don't think it would be wise nor appropriate, before we're even in office or even at any public forum such as this, to discuss the parameters of what those potential concessions can be for either side. Suffice it to say, I do think, to be honest with the committee and the full Senate, if you want to reach agreements to end armed conflict where people are dying on a daily basis and enormous destruction is occurring and a great potential for escalation exists on a daily basis, if we want to be honest about bringing that to an end, True diplomacy will require concessions from every party engaged in those conversations. That's the nature of diplomacy, and it's best conducted directly and in an appropriate forum and not in public. And that can be done, by the way, without abandoning our core principles as a nation or our feelings as a people about what's happened and transpired in that conflict to date.
Senator Van